Journalist organizations have condemned French police after 2 reporters were detained on Saturday during the 23rd consecutive weekend of the Yellow Vest protests. Live now to Paris, and our correspondent Charlotte Dubinsky. Charlotte, what more can you tell us about these detentions?
Well, the 2 independent journalists were amongst the more than 200 individuals who were detained by police, arrested at Act 23. Their names are Gaspard Galance and also Alexis Kraland. And we know that the Paris prosecutor has said that they were arrested for participation in a group to commit violence or degradation. Now, we know that Galance's detention was actually filmed and has been spread through social media. He was clearly marked up as a journalist with his head casque saying the words TV on it. And we know that from that video, it appears that he was actually seeking out the commandeer of the officers who were at that protest before he was actually arrested. We understand that's because he says he had been injured by a tear gas grenade that had been launched by the officers during that protest. Now, he's not the only journalist who said that they were injured on Saturday. In Paris and Toulouse, several journalists reported injuries, mainly it appears coming from those grenades, from the tear gas that's launched by the officers at these protests. Now, the Interior Ministry has been talking about the arrests of these journalists. It said that the police, the CRS, these officers are out every week. They're out to try and make sure that there is safety for the demonstrators and the journalists to carry out these protests and also to cover these protests that have been happening now since November, every week since November here in France. But that statement from the Interior Ministry then goes on to say that if journalists are deemed to have committed an offence, then they are likely to also be detained and arrested by the officers on the ground. Now, the National Union of Journalists in France sees that as being a threat, and it has gone even further, saying it believes that some journalists are being specifically targeted.
There's a question emerging. Is there determination to intimidate journalists? We have an impression some of them are being targeted.
Since the Yellow Vest movement appeared, the number of incidents targeting journalists when they are filming or photographing hampers the work of the press and limits the coverage of events which represent crucial public interest.
It's now 5 months since this protest movement began, 23 consecutive weeks of protests, and every week thousands of officers are out on the streets to try and control those protests. Last Saturday at Act 23, there were some 60,000 officers deployed across France to try and control those protests. And we've also seen the protesters turning on the police in recent weeks, specifically on Saturday, where there were protesters filmed screaming at the police, "Go kill yourselves." Let's take a look at the violence that marred yet another Gilets jaunes protest.